Welcome to our webinar on insurgency and transformative justice. Welcome to this important panel discussion on insurgency and transitional justice in Africa. My name is Kathy-Ann Potgieter, and I'll be your moderator for today. And on behalf of Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, or CSVR, this session forms part of CSVR's broader efforts to understand and respond to complex drivers of violence and conflict on the continent, while promoting inclusive and justice-based solutions. And today's discussion will examine the nature of insurgency in Africa, its political and military dimensions, and explore how TJ tools can be used to address its root causes and long-term impact. We're joined by two expert panelists who bring a deep knowledge and experience to this conversation. Dr. Rhuks Ako is a governance and peace-building expert with extensive experience advising academic institutions such as the AU, the UN, and GIZ. He has also held academic positions in Nigeria and the UK and brings valuable insights into conflict prevention, youth engagement, and policy development in Africa. Welcome, Dr. Ako. And then Dr. Miamingi is an international lawyer and human rights expert with over 17 years of experience across policy, advocacy, and academia. He is the co-founder and CEO of Integrate Africa Advisory Services and has worked extensively on governance and transitional justice across the continent. Welcome, Dr. Miamingi. We'll begin with individual presentations, followed by a discussion and audience Q&A. And please feel free to post your questions in the chat throughout the session. I just want to see if our executive director is available to provide some welcoming comments, and I see she is. So I'll just, before we begin, allow our Ms. Anna Moyo to give some welcoming comments as well. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you, Kathy, Anne, and good morning, everyone. We are delighted to host this webinar today, looking at insurgency and transitional justice in Africa. It is a timely discussion for us to have, particularly given what's happening in a number of countries on the African continent. You look at the Sahel region, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali are three countries that have been subjected to insurgency and violent extremism, particularly with the youth being conscripted into violent extremism and insurgent groups. But we have also seen in northern Mozambique as well, the insurgent groups also pushing forward, particularly in Cabo Delgado, in the northern parts of Mozambique. And all of this point to a bleak picture. When you also look at the very nature of insurgency and violent extremism, these are crimes, these are occurrences that transcend borders. So we are not talking about national conflicts. We are talking about conflicts, transnational conflicts. We are talking as well about the international dimension of it, the conscription, not only to the local groups in the country, but also to larger parts, particularly the Islamic State and other groups that have continued to push into the African continent, also pushing a radicalized agenda. Our youth really are vulnerable to some of these occurrences, owing to some of the marginalization and exclusion in decision and key processes within a country, key peace building, key peacemaking, key transitional justice, and decision-making processes. The youth continue to be on the periphery of society, and this makes it easy for them to become vulnerable to some of these groups, which promise them a sense of belonging, power, and access to resources that they would not necessarily have access to in the normal course of business within their countries. So we are really fighting a battle that if we continue to use a securitized or a heavily militarized approach, we will continue to lose on the African continent. Most of the approaches that many of our governments have used really rely on militarized action to fight insurgency. But what we are also seeing is that insurgent groups are better equipped in terms of armory and weapons than even some of our government soldiers, making even the fight against insurgency difficult. At the same time, a lot of these approaches have not looked at the key drivers and some of the root causes of these conflicts and the conscription of youth. And this is problematic because, again, government action is really fighting symptoms, but not the root causes. That's why we continue to see resurgence of some of these insurgent groups in the conscription of our youth. Without much further ado, I invite all of us for robust discussions, robust sharing of reflections, as well as lessons learned and how best we can come together as a continent to fight against this scourge on the African continent. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And thank you for that introduction. And I will now hand over to Dr. Ako to begin on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and good morning, everyone. Just before I begin, just to check that I am audible.
Loud and clear, thank you.
Fantastic. Just also to let you know that Dr. Remember is logged in, but he's on the attendee, so you might have to enable him from there. He noted he had connection problems earlier. But thank you so much for the invitation to be on this panel. I think it's a really important and notable topic. While Hannah was speaking, I took note of two key things that she mentioned. The first being the youth dimension to insurgencies. And for those who know a bit more of my background, I am really, big on youth peace and security. So I will be sort of linking my conversation to that. The second is how insurgencies have now taken a dimension that is transnational. They're not occurring within state borders. And so, responses to them must be properly thought out in more of a multilateral context, while emphasizing the different specificities of national situations and circumstances. The brief I have is quite simple and straightforward. It's to sort of engage in the narrative of insurgency, what it means, its elements, what instigates and drives insurgencies, and so on. And I will spend maybe about 15 minutes to do this, so that my colleague, Dr. Remember, can also jump on and share perspectives as well. Insurgency, really, when we talk about insurgencies, what we're referring to is organized rebellion against an established government. So what we're saying is that there is a government, and then there is a movement to change something fundamental about that government, either the system of it or the personnel of it. And this differs from terrorism, which is really, smaller groups organized to drive an agenda that they want a sitting government to engage with, and not necessarily thinking about changing the government itself. So what that tells us is that, if we put this on a scale, when we talk about insurgencies, they are, of course, more dangerous in the sense that the time frame could be extremely long in terms of changing that political order, which usually is more powerful and more established, both in political, diplomatic settings and military power as well. What are the components of insurgencies? Typically, there's a political motivation, and this is what drives such movements. Usually, it is to change the regime, cessation, or to gain greater autonomy for perhaps an ethnic group or a geographic entity within a national setting. Usually, these goals are rooted in shall we say, lapses in the social contract. In other words, the government is failing in its duty to provide social goods. And this is why I'll bring out, the youth element in the first instance, where governments are unable to deliver, the basic necessities, and this is just providing an enabling environment for the younger population to flourish, to be able to chase their dreams, to be able to make ends meet, to be able to exercise their basic freedoms, to be able to have access to systems where grievances may be brought about and resolved. Then there becomes, growing disaffection with both the government and, in quote, the style or modus operandi of that government. Usually, insurgents will rely on recruiting of membership, training of those members, and of course, upkeep of those members. Again, the youth element comes out here because these are the population that are, easily, well, not easily in terms of not having roots, but they are easier to manipulate, so to speak. And they are more energetic. They're able to, be part of a fighting force as well. They are also more susceptible to, taking on propaganda. They have more access to tools, the internet and the dark internet, as a matter of fact, which are things that perhaps the older generation are more aloof or even perhaps unaware of. So what this means is that when we talk about insurgencies and the elements that make up insurgencies, you'll see that these are things that are more engaging, or youth are more engaged through these processes. And so there's always that need to, emphasize that angle of the demographic that are more likely to be engaged in these insurgent movements. What are some elements that enable insurgencies to evolve or survive? The first is popular support. And I'll digress a little bit. In a conversation about, the rising speed of coup d'etats on the continent, I had to correct a perception that young people look forward to coups because, it's the right way to go, based on my argument that that is young people would support anything that does not enable them achieve their dreams. They would support movements they believe will help them achieve their dreams. Not necessarily because these are better movements, but just by virtue of their age group, they have seen nothing but, in our situation on the continent, quote unquote, failing democracy. And so when insurgent groups promise services that the government is not providing, shelter, food, salaries, stipends, whatever we may call them, then they begin to support those movements because they see them as the framework within which their aspirations may be chased or met. Another reason why insurgencies survive is that state power is more or less incapable of controlling the territories. Even for smaller countries, we see that governments are concentrated in the urban centers, while those in, the rural, or what some might refer to as the hinterlands, are left out of governance. So they don't have the basic, power, potable water, roads, access to justice. And what this means is insurgency movements are able to sort of grow and thrive from these out of government reach environments. And, this sort of also contributes to sustaining these movements. What are some of the key drivers of insurgency on the continent? Again, I think I've mentioned some of these already, basically governance issues. There's corruption, there's hindrance to the rule of law, access to justice, social and public goods. And, what all these lead to is discontent amongst, the populace. But again, like I mentioned, for younger people who have literally not experienced any other form of government, any option will be deemed viable. And this is, perhaps one of the reasons why, insurgencies are growing on the continent. And what are some of the current trends that we're seeing in terms of insurgent activities across the continent? Again, first is decentralization of operations. Insurgent groups are smart in the sense that as they evolve, they seek the opportunities and opportunities that there are to challenge state power. And the easiest way of doing that really is evolving from regions or areas where the state is absent. In other words, they are operating from areas where state presence is limited. So that's one of the main trends that I want to highlight. The second, just like Hannah mentioned, is the Islamic militant movements that we see, across the Sahel and also spilling to the coast of West Africa. Again, not the same conversation, but it's also one of the drivers for perhaps the rise in military coups in West Africa and the evolution of AES. Reason I'm saying this is one of the core reasons that the military has given in these countries is the security situation, which really is about Islamic militancy. So what we're seeing here is how also insurgent activities are destabilizing what was becoming an established region in terms of democracy and democratic principles. And you can see now how that insurgency is really threatening not just ECOWAS as an organization, but the bedrock of democracy in that region. The other thing I want to highlight is the impact of food insecurity and climate change on insurgency. Climate change is making things more difficult in terms of people populations being able to earn their living. They are migrating from their homesteads. And all of this is also having a direct impact on insurgency, where categories of people are feeling insecure about food, for example. You're not able to farm. You're not able to grow crops as you've always done. But there's a movement that is promising, money, feeding, accommodation. There's that temptation, to engage them. Another trend that I want to highlight is the seemingly ineffective regional responses And the further fragmentation, particularly in West Africa, of ECOWAS and now AES, and then there's the MNJTF, and then there's the G5 Sahel. All the fragmentation of responses, leads one to begin to question the efficacy. This is not to suggest that, there's LCBC in the mix as well. This is not to suggest that they haven't made positive contribution towards the fight against insurgency. But the question is, with a multiplicity and perhaps even duplicity of these institutions and what they are seeking to achieve, would we have a better response in terms of now sort of having systems that speak to one another? I mean, I know for a fact that ECOWAS is trying to engage AES to ensure that even if diplomatic political ties are not as great, that those on security are not fractured, so that there can be responses to the various insurgency movements. But how that will play along is yet to be seen. The final trend I want to highlight is, again, the youth angle to this. And I think it's important that these sort of conversations take place to socialize the young demographic on the continent, to understand the dangers and the repercussions of engaging with, be they terrorist movements, insurgencies, military dictatorships. For anyone who has not experienced something, anything will be better than that something. In other words, where you've not experienced life under war or insurgency or a military dictatorship, you would forgo your rights under a democracy if you believe, that those will deliver. But the question now is, do they actually deliver? I think not. And that's why I think that these conversations, as cogent as they are, across the board, we also need to begin to think about how to focus on young people getting the message. And this is not in any way to absolve, what we have as a democratic leadership that is also failing this population, perhaps arguably increasingly. And there needs to be that realization and, draw the nexus between governance, insurgencies, and, youth restlessness. I will stop here. I was going to take 15 minutes to enable my good friend and brother, Dr. Remember Miamingi, also come in. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ako. I will, excuse me, I will hand over to Dr. Miamingi for the next portion of the panel. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Miamingi. Is everyone able to hear?
So he is, I can see him listed under the attendees. So maybe you might have to enable his.
Okay, I see there. It's also under the panelists. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Dr. Remember. Thank you.
Okay, my sincere apologies for the link confusion. Now, first of all, I want to thank the Center for the invitation, but also for the timeliness of this conversation. From what Dr. Rhuks have just outlined, two things will stand out clearly. One, that it is most likely that at this time, more than at any other time in our recent history, the continent, depending on the definitions that you provide in terms of insurgency, is experiencing an increase and expansion of the activities of insurgency, and insurgency intermingled with extreme group or terrorists, depending on your definition. We can put that numbers between 20 to 25 countries. And that's more than half of the countries on the continent. But the second point emanating from Dr. Rhuks, of course, presentation is that these insurgencies are complex in their causes. They are also complex in their character, and of course, complex in the result of this engagement, of these insurgency activities. And what that complexity then does, and feeding into my intervention, is that as transitional justice practitioners, we must probably start this conversation with an inconvenient fact that transitional justice and its traditional pillars as we know it, that of truth, justice, reparations, and guarantee of non-occurrence, may be necessary, relevant, but insufficient to deal with the complexity of the context that Dr. Rhuks have just eloquently outlined. And therefore, we may have to vernacularize or domesticate these transitional justice from this neoliberal peacemaking paradigm that was probably designed and understood to operate in a context that was symmetrical. But as we are talking at a context that is very disorderly, contested, and fluid, and this context in which insurgencies thrive, we must therefore be able to reimagine our approach and understanding to transitional justice. And the proposition I intend to make in this conversation is that we may have to somehow reposition transitional justice framework as something that is capable of operating in transitional conditions rather than transitional moments. In other words, it should be able to operate side by side with conflicts, side by side with insurgency operations, and not just wait for the time when insurgent activities peacefully come to an end through a negotiated processes, and therefore transitional justice mechanisms are outlined and put in place to operate. And therefore, we should be able to both, in transitional conditions, if possible, and then of course continue in transitional moments. That's the first proposition. Of course, the second proposition is that then that process may have to be adaptive. It may have to operate in a fragmented but sequential manner and be politically negotiated. And I will be coming to this concept of political relevance, transitional justice throughout this presentation. Now, what is the value of ensuring that the transitional justice processes and the mechanisms are instituted side by side with insurgency operations, and also when that insurgency operation come to an end? First, because transitional justice then processes is able to disrupt the insurgency narratives that usually the insurgency themselves present themselves as a justice delivery mechanism. And by addressing concurrently some of those grievances and those exploitations, what then happen is that the fuel that would have provided the energy for that insurgency would concurrently be reducing, and therefore providing an opportunity for a faster end to that conflict and a proper operation of a transitional justice system. That is the value of the proposition that I intend to make. But the final point in terms of context that I intend to make is that transitional justice, unlike justice we understand it as lawyers, that is said to be blind, transitional justice cannot be blind. Transitional justice has eyes. It is therefore important to understand which direction in terms of design and operation is transitional justice looking, because transitional justice may operate as a retributive mechanism on the understanding that wrongdoings create a moral, legal, and political debt. And only punishment can offset that. Only punishment can pay it off, right? And therefore, the understanding will be that of criminal trial, lost rations, and so on and so forth. It could also, as a mechanism, be restorative in terms of the understanding that injury is not just a debt, it is a relational issue. And the best way to address that injury is perhaps through repair of trust, and not necessarily and exclusively through punishment. Or transitional justice can operate or can look as a transformative mechanism where it looked at the entire conflict that is providing the basis of the insurgency as a structural issue, is a structural injustice, and therefore addressing the structural root causes of that injustice is the only way to be able to bring that conflict or that insurgency to an end. And therefore, which direction, whether it's looking backward or forward, a transitional justice mechanism relating to insurgency is conceptualized, designed, and operationalized is important. It therefore is important to see transitional justice not only as a mechanism that rectified and therefore look backward, but it must be a transformative mechanism that look forward. And the reason I say this is that that way, then it is a transitional justice that does not look as if it is a photo shot in a particular period of history, but rather a movie that is ongoing, addressing the context as it has. And in that context, of course, we've talked of those traditional pillars, which is truth, accountability, reparation, non-occurrence. Of course, those cross-cutting issues that are there. But when we are relating this traditional pillar to the context of insurgency, it is my contention that it is therefore important that we reframe this to play both, of course, the legal, the truth and the reconciliation component, but importantly, the political component of it. Why? Because justice processes in an insurgency context must navigate contested categories of who is a victim and who is culpable. In fact, for some insurgency groups, if not all of them, they're actually the good guys. And they are just exercising their right to defense and therefore holy anger. And as part of that holy anger, they're actually engaged in a just war. And that in itself places them outside the reach of any wrong. Because if they have done any wrong, it is to right a wrong. And therefore, to even conceive that they could be they themselves could be perpetrators itself is important. A conversation to have, and you from the ANC here to all other countries, this is a conversation that has been there, and it's been drafting, conceptualizing. It is important that we look at this from that who is a victim and who is a perpetrator. Those are politically constructed concepts, and therefore transitional justice must navigate, of course, and not erase these ambiguities. The second point, that political point I want to make, is that in reframing those cardinal principles, it is important that transitional justice must address itself and recalibrate the moral economies of insurgency in those communities. And by moral economy, I refer to the processes and the system in which the community assign blames, assign dignity and legitimacy in the context of war. And these moral economies, transitional justice must not only be sensitive to, but must work to transform it by creating new narratives that then reinforce public authority and legitimacy, that also ensures that it's not just institutional mechanism, but also trust at all levels becomes increasingly important. And therefore, the final point under here that I want to make is to say that insurgency often emerge because of knowledge erasures. The belief that they are invisible, they've been denied, and they do not exist. And so it's therefore important, as we talk about truth and justice and reconciliation, to interrogate as we design and engage whose truths are being heard, whose truths are archived, and whose truths are legitimized. And Rwanda will come into mind as we discuss these issues of truth and the issues of erasure, and how that is then put into ensure then that in designing and operationalizing a transitional justice, we interrogate those issues of silence, dominant narratives, of course, colonial knowledge, and erasures. Of course, insisting again that this conceptual framework must operate within a framework that understands justice slightly different. We can understand it as a process relating to the insurgency or as an outcome. What is it that we want to deliver in that context, or how we want to deliver it and design and prioritize that way? It is also important to decide whether in an insurgency context, transitional justice should aim for perfection in terms of justice, or should be realistic in terms of harm reduction and of feasibility, and should be able to balance issues of individual and collective culpability or remedies. Because in that context, people act as individuals, but they act as community, and insurgency create a new identity sometimes that reinforces and superimposes on existing identities and should be addressed that way. And we must, of course, keep in mind the questions of issues of recognition, recognizing the cultural respect that Dr. Rhuks that alluded to in terms of the context of insurgency, ethnicity, religion, and gender identity that in themselves could be root causes of conflict, but drivers for justice, and how we work through that recognition and designing and thinking about how those grievances around redistribution are inputted into material leveling, looking at the questions of land, resources, economic opportunities, and issues of representation, so that when it is presented to the insurgent group and insurgents context, this justice not only affirms issues of identity, it also addresses material condition and also provide a political voice in that context. It is important, in my opinion, too, to keep in mind that transitional justice in this context must marry universal principle with contextual pluralism. I can't overemphasize that, because conflict is local, and so is politics, and in many cases, so is economy, and the dynamics have to be understood. It is important to, in my opinion, to look at the questions of power, agencies, and the structure in that context. And as we deal with whether we're looking back, present, and whether we're looking forward, transitional justice related to insurgency must address the question of intergenerational justice in terms of, and now, as Rhuks mentioned, even ecological justice. because insurgency may lead to destruction of ecology, the environment, and all that. And keeping in mind, of course, that success in this context cannot just be win in courts, cannot just be truth that has been said in the mechanism, but it must be that survivors and ex-combatants can live lives that they value. So the point I'm making is that transitional justice in the context of insurgency need to be seen and appreciated as a counter-insurgency strategy. What? Not just, of course, peace building and all others, because sometimes insurgency are just symptoms of a deep rupture. And it could be governance vacuum, colonial legacies, partial inequalities, name it. So responsive to those insurgency or the factors cannot be purely that of power and security and DDR and all that. It must offer a different proposition. It must attack the basis of those insurgency, ideological legitimacy, and its social embeddedness. Because, just like Rhuks said, popular support for insurgency is important, and popular support is rooted in that ideological legitimacy and the fact that the grievances people can relate to. And therefore, justice-centered transformation must not only disrupt that moral infrastructure, it must result into expanded political imagination in its conceptualization, its design, and its implementation. And therefore, it should be, in my opinion, link issues and not work in silos. For example, the issues of reintegration and the legitimacy. Usually, we understand reintegration is sometimes framed in the sense of case we need vocational training and somewhere psychological support. Yes, important, but cosmetic. Reintegration succeeds when local social contract is renegotiated and power and resources are redistributed. And that happens when those who are former fighters don't just get jobs, but they also get themselves reinserted back into the narrative of equal citizenship. And amnesty alone cannot do this. Truth-telling mechanism must allow the former combatants to reorder their roles in nation building. That also leads to issues of affected communities. And in designing and understanding this transitional justice to create mechanism, it is important that the state, as we understand it in insurgency, step back, not out, to be able to allow some form of vernacular legitimacy to emerge. So therefore, we should, in my opinion, move from DDR to DDR-TJ, because then we are linking demobilization to issues of community-based truth selling. We're linking transitional livelihood, tying ex-combatants' economic stability to issues of local public good. We also tying this to healings. And I have a number of cases that I will not go to because I had also given myself 15 minutes and I'm 16. You can look at Central African Republic, where sequencing was problematic, was not technical. You can look at Nigeria, where traditional mechanism actually outperformed DDR programs that were run by the state. We can look at Mozambique that is going Rwanda, South Sudan, Somalia, Sierra Leone, and South Africa, where justice was created for peace and reconciliation, and the reparation remains unfinished business. And what are the issues in there? Let me bring this conversation to an end. Some of the risks that transitional justice encounter in the context of an active conflict zone, which I suggest we should not wait for it to come. Of course, weaponization of transitional justice, the questions of participation risk and their designs for it, but also the question of too dependent on donor-driven mechanism and resources, of course, and the crisis around expectation, raising hope among victims that transitional justice process cannot deliver. It's therefore important that we embrace issue of partial justice over perfect justice when we're dealing with insurgency, and that we look at layered legitimacy that bring a different number of actors, and we institutionalize mechanisms. In my conclusion, I would say that if we are serious about breaking the cycles of insurgency on this continent, then transitional justice must involve as a mechanism, as a tool in the toolbox to do that. It should not just as an event, it must be a process. It cannot just be a legal ritual. It must be a political refoundation, reset, not just a technocratic process. It must be an insurgent peace-building mechanism. So ultimately, TJ's highest function must not merely be to tide up the past, but to disrupt the present and reimagine the future. When done right, in my opinion, TJ does not just rebuild order, it rebuilds legitimacy through justice. Thank you.
Thank you both for the very rich discussion and panel. Excuse me. Let's now take a few questions from the audience. If anyone with questions could please submit them into the chat, and then I'll read them out to the panel. Or if anyone wants to raise their hands, that's also an option. I see Dr. Baba Jallo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thanks a lot to our two panelists for those excellent presentations. We're speaking about transitional justice within conflict situations. So my question to the panelists would be, how do they think that we should, or we can incorporate peacemaking, peace education, and conflict resolution strategies into transitional justice processes within these environments? Because at the end of the day, there is a conflict ongoing. There is a TJ mechanism that is proposed. So there should be, I think, efforts to incorporate peace education, peacemaking, and conflict resolution strategies into these TJ processes. So my question would be, how do they think we can do that effectively to address the insurgency and end the conflict? Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Jallo. Dr. Ako or Dr. Miamingi, over to you.
Okay, I'll just give my quick 2 cents on this. Thank you so much, Dr. Jallo, for the question. And you will remember that when I was making my presentation, I kept emphasizing socializing young people. You know, whatever we want to call it, peace education, peace clubs, you know, whatever method we want to use, it's all about socializing youth. And the question I'll put back to you in a sense is, does socializing youth on peace only take place in peaceful times? The answer to that is no. So I think even as conflicts are ongoing, there are lessons to be learned. You know, if we use the example I gave, you know, that, you know, young people sometimes would support alternatives to democratic governance. Democratic governance is all they've known. It's failing them. It's failed them. So any other option would be seen as, you know, even if in a transitional kind of way, welcome, you know, as long as they see the likelihood of them achieving their expectations through that. So it's in the same light that, you know, I think that in situations of peace, you know, it's hard to educate on peace because that's all they know. But when there are conflicts, then you can, if you like, point out, why peace is important. How can that be done? There are different ways, it could be through, like you said, peace education in schools, or, if they're really active conflict zones, then the question is, are there schools in the traditional sense? And that's why I didn't use, education, but I use socialization. And that takes place in any, can take place in any context without the need for, walls. Just an anecdote, and I'll stop after this. We were having, and at this time I was running the Youth for Peace Africa program. This was in, I think, 2019 or 20. We were in Botswana and we were doing regional conversations. And a young woman said that they had found a bomb, close to Parliament, and that, young people in the country were rushing over there to take selfies and pictures, because they had never seen the bomb. And if you sort of take this to the context of Sudan, or even the Niger Delta in Nigeria, or Somalia, I'm not sure young people will see, anyone of any age for that matter, would see a bomb and, want to take a selfie. You would run for cover. What am I trying to point out here is that the different contexts and the different kinds of socialization methods would necessarily differ. And here, that the specificity in the context need to be taken on board to determine how this would be most effective. So like I said, if it's a really active conflict zone, obviously peace education in the context of school curriculum would not be ideal, but socialization in terms of young children who are in certain communities or even in camps, would be more appropriate. So I think this is one of those where the situation and the circumstances would really determine what should be a well thought out process of socializing in terms of active conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Dr. Rhuks. Dr. Remember, if you have anything to add, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Starting from where Rhuks ended, to say that this is a very complex question that also must then be understood and approached within specific context. But broadly speaking, I think my first preposition is that peace is an individual goods, public good. It is local. It is community. And it is this person to person, community within community to community, that then eventually become national peace. And if we do not address it at the level of that individual, at the local level, at the community level, and bring in traditional leaders, it is going to be important to do it through formal mechanism at national level. And so depending on the context, conflict as it is going on, all these community local structures are always active. And we have seen in the context of South Sudan, where side by side, you've had community to community local peace processes aimed at addressing grievances that are local, but also in calculating peaceful education, as you mentioned and Rhuks alluded to. And so it is important to embed peace, transitional peace making, peace building mechanism within the local meaning and local structures in these conflict areas, taking into consideration, of course, the sensitivity that is there. Perhaps it is also important for transitional justice practitioners to explore how do we link transitional justice to humanitarian assistance, so that along there is no part of this conflict, even maybe around the terrorist and the insurgencies, I mean terrorist context, and we're not talking about, but within the insurgency areas, you probably will see humanitarian actors operating and a humanitarian service is being delivered at one level or the other. How can transitional justice mechanism in the sense of peace education that you refer to, or peace building mechanism being cooperated and co-delivered with issues of humanitarian assistance, but also how do we collocate this mechanism, whether it is in protection of civilian sites or in refugee sites or in IDP camps? How do we ensure that transitional justice tools, including peace education, collocate in these areas and operate? Because sometimes people that are in IDPs, they go there as children, emerge as young people, as Rhuks mentioned, and are recruited and become active and go into refugee camp. So it is a network that has to be disrupted and disrupted at every single side that the threats to peace exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Member and Dr. Rhuks. Thank you for sharing such thoughtful and grounded insights. I think we are out of time for more questions, but thank you, Dr. Jallo. Today's discussion helped us better understand insurgency, not only as a security issue, but a deeply political challenge shaped by many factors that have been mentioned, such as exclusion, governance failures, and other grievances. And we also heard how TJ can offer more sustainable pathways to peace. To our audience, thank you for engaging with us, and we will be preparing a policy brief from this discussion, and it will be shared in due course. On behalf of CSVR, we appreciate your time and interest in this important issue. And please stay connected with CSVR for future events and initiatives. And again, thank you so much to our speakers again. And have a great day and goodbye for now.